President, Labor is supporting this bill, as previous speakers have detailed, but there are valid concerns about the implications for thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have signed up for funeral cover under the Aboriginal Community Benefits Fund. And I'd like to bring this to the attention of the Senate because I think, Minister, it's enormously important that these stories of First Nations people are heard here on the record. And certainly I would like to see, in terms of my constituency in the Northern Territory, but indeed right across Australia, that there is a profound effort to look at these concerns that I'm going to raise in my speech. Schedule 2 of this legislation extends consumer protection provisions of the ASIC Act 2001 to cover funeral insurance policies. The interim report of the Haynes Royal Commission identified a number of issues with funeral insurance, in particular the sale of funeral insurance products to First Nations people. Recommendation 4.2 from the Royal Commission interim report proposed removing the exemptions for funeral expenses policies. It says the law should be amended to remove the exclusion of funeral expenses policies from the definition of financial product and put beyond doubt that the consumer protection provisions of the ASIC Act apply to funeral expenses policies. There is a history of vulnerable people being targeted and exploited by dodgy selling practices when it comes to funeral expenses policies. Now, I just digress a bit, just to give you an example. Across the Northern Territory, we have over 200 communities, remote communities, but our death rates are so enormously high. And we're obviously going to hear more about that in Closing the Gap next week in the report by the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader to the Parliament. But in terms of funerals, lots of communities, we have over 100 Aboriginal languages. There is sorry business at some place or more than one place across the Northern Territory every week. Sorry business where someone's passed away, where those who are sick, usually on renal dialysis or other health complications, choose to go back home because they want to be on country. So the costs involved in holding funerals in these places across remote regions of Australia are enormously high. From the protection of the body in the morgues, a lot of the morgues are not in these communities, therefore places like Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Katherine and Darwin and Nhulunbuy become the focus. Places in Arnhem Land that cannot hold bodies, they then have to work out places in the wet season to be able to fly their loved ones in. So the cost just of burial is extremely high in these remote places. The Haynes Royal Commission heard some disturbing and, quite frankly, sickening examples of how First Nations people have been targeted by companies with some what can only be described as dodgy selling practices. I would go so far to say it's worse than dodgy. It is certainly about greed. It is certainly about an uncaring position towards those who are enormously vulnerable in Australia. It must be remembered that First Nations people have lower life expectancy, higher morbidity rates, high risk of life-threatening illness, and we spend a lot of time at funerals. I'm constantly involved with families across the Northern Territory and constituents with some aspect of sorry business. Just over the Christmas and New Year break, we were remembering a number of family members for people in Arnhem Land, in the Gulf region, and also in the Wadeye region, the west of the Territory. Too much time and too much money from the First Nations community is spent on the death industry, and it's something this Senate could actually have a really good look at. When I mentioned that the cost of having funerals, there are other additional costs that come in terms of being able to relocate loved ones from the hospitals or morgues in Darwin, Katherine, Tennant Creek or Alice Springs and Nhulunbuy. There are costs like will they fly their loved ones? Or will they come by road? What about in the wet season when some of those roads are cut? And then we have issues with particular places like Borroloola, where my family come from, and the other communities that do have morgues. When the power goes down, when technology goes down due to flooding or any other circumstances, there is a roll-on effect of the cost. And then there is the emotional and well-being cost to families themselves in how to deal with the loss of a loved one. If I can just reflect on my clan system with the Yanyo people, when someone passes away, a couple of things come into place. The first thing is the respect of that person who's died. We can't say their name. So in my language, we call that person Murinji. Murinji means that person has passed away and we can't say their name anymore. And we follow that respect right up to the burial of the person. And for many, many families, the burial of a person can take up to 3 months. Up to 3 months before they can actually have the funeral. So the sorry business period is from the immediate moment that a loved one dies to when the loved one is buried. So if financially people have been unable to afford the cost of a funeral, afford the cost of transporting a body by plane or by vehicle, to also have to pay for the cost of a coffin, all these things are considered in that period of sorry business mourning. Now sometimes in Arnhem Land, that can blow out to 6 months. If you talk to some of the hospitals in the Northern Territory, they will tell you that they've had bodies in there for many, many months. And this is unfortunately the reality of First Nations people in particular in the Northern Territory, and I'm absolutely certain that it's replicated in far north Queensland and certainly in the far west of Western Australia and possibly across the country. But again, the Senate needs to be able to examine just what is going on in this space of sorry business and death. The Haynes Royal Commission has clearly outlined and made some very real comments about the efficacy or lack of efficacy of the Aboriginal Community Benefits Fund. And I do want to speak very clearly about that and the absolute need for the government to make sure that the people who have invested in that scheme, and we know that there are thousands of those people, are not disenfranchised because of the passing of this bill and the potential for organisations to fall over. My colleagues in the other place have written to the Minister drawing his attention to the 19,000 people who have invested in the Aboriginal Community Benefits Fund over many years. They invested in good faith and should not be left out of pocket, disadvantaged because of this legislation. I would also say that more needs to be done to prevent all Australians, and in particular First Nations people in remote areas, from being fleeced by very, very expensive funerals. I believe we need to look at the overall expenses and profits being made by the industry that surrounds death. People should not be exploited at one of the most vulnerable times of their lives.